Hi. We're going over with James Orr the fundamentals of the Christian faith from a book that he published for general audience called Sidelights on Christian Doctrine. Here he discusses the doctrine of God. He starts with the doctrine of theology, that is the excuse for theology. We saw that in the last episode, and this is the doctrine of God where all things theological begin. These remarks on the necessity and place of doctrine in the Christian religion will best receive illustration from the subject it is now proposed to consider, the doctrine of God. The doctrine of God, it need scarcely be said, lies at the foundation of all right thinking in religion. In strictness, theology is just the doctrine of God. That is the meaning of the word. God is the Alpha and Omega of theological study. For as a man thinks about his God, so will his theology be all through. It is not too strong to say that, in principle, every question of importance which arises in theology is already practically settled in the doctrine of God and his attributes. So essential is it to begin with scripturally right thoughts about God. The doctrine of God furnishes us with proof of the need of theology and the possibility of getting away from it. For the first thing evidently we have to do when we speak of a doctrine of God is to say what we mean by God. What do you mean by this term God? This is a fair question to ask any man who uses the word. And the instant you begin to answer that question, you begin to make statements which belong to theology. Thus, there are those who call themselves atheists, who say boldly that there is no God. You pull yourself together and make the counter-assertion, yes, there is a God. Well, there is already a definite assertion, and the opponent is quite entitled to turn around and say, do you know what you mean when you make that statement? If you try to tell him, you are taking a first great step into theology. There were those in the old religions who believed, and still are millions in the world who believe, that there are many gods. Polytheists, we call them. As Christians, we declare that there is one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. That's Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Thou believest that God is one. That's James 2:19. We proclaim the unity of God, and in making this affirmation against polytheism, we are laying down a great basal proposition in theology. One, too, it can confidently be said, in which we have with us the best modern thought and science. There is no one almost who believes in God in any sense who would now deny his unity. It is a cardinal axiom of modern science that the system of things which constitute the universe, therefore the power to which it owes its origin, is one. Well, but you find another class of people who say, yes, there is a great power, a great inscrutable power in the universe which manifests itself in all that there is. But then they deny the distinction between the world and God. God and the world, they tell you, are not really distinct. God's life is just the life he has in the world. His life is merged in the life of the world. He is the soul, the essence, the substance of the world. The world is the manifestation of God, his soul manifestation. He has no personal life of his own. We call these people pantheists because they say that God is all. But we, as Christians, come with a contrary affirmation. We say, no, it is true that God is in the world. He is its author, creator, upholder, is in everything in a way which nothing else can be, but nevertheless, God's life is not merely in the world. He also has a personal existence above the world. He is in all things and through all things, but he is also above all things. He has given rise to the world by a free creative act of his will. But he himself is above the world in his transcendent being, eternally possessing himself in the fullness of his own self-conscious life. In making these affirmations, we have separated ourselves from pantheism and are building up a theology about God. It is the same when we come to the more specific affirmations about God. There have been those who said that God had a beginning, an origin in time, that he was localized in space. There have been those who said, some do say still, that God is a being who is limited in his wisdom, his knowledge, and his power. There are those who would limit God in various ways, pointing out the seeming imperfections of the world in proof. But we Christians believe that God is infinite in all his perfections. We not only deny these limitations of God, But we put in their place the opposite affirmations. We say God is eternal, is all-powerful, is all-knowing, is all-loving. But we could not believe in a God who was not infinite in all these respects. When we name God, we mean just a being who has these perfections. We go further and say that if God had not these perfections, he would not be God. This, let me say in passing, is one reason why it is not strictly correct to speak, as we sometimes do, of the being of a God, or of belief in a God. It is not uncommon to see the question stated in discussion, is there a God? It is asked, do you believe in a God, or can you prove the existence of a God? Popularly and provisionally, such language is permissible. Strictly, it is not correct, because, in the nature of the case, there can be but one God. There is of necessity but one infinite, eternal, perfect being. God cannot be thought of as one of a class or as belonging to a class in any way. If God is, there is none beside him. I am God and there is none else, says Isaiah chapter 46, verse 9. To take only one illustration more, there are those who say, yes, there is this power in the world working through all things, but then he is so great, so vast, so infinite, that we cannot know him. Our faculties are finite. There is in our minds an inherent incapacity to know a being who is infinite, absolute, as philosophy would say, unconditioned. This phase of denial is called agnosticism. The late Herbert Spencer was a representative of it. Now, we either believe this or we do not. If we believe it, theology, of course, is at an end. But then we are not called upon to believe it. As Christians, we all do acknowledge that God is in infinite ways incomprehensible by finite minds. We acknowledge that God is in the depths of his absolute being beyond our ken. That all we can ever know of him is little compared with what we do not know. Canst thou by searching find out God? So says Job 11 verse 7. His judgments are unsearchable. His ways just past tracing out. Romans 11 verse 33 makes that affirmation, as well as the Old Testament. But this is a very different thing from saying that God cannot be known by us at all, or as some would have it, can be known only in dim and indefinite symbol. We may not know God in the depths of his absolute being, but we can at least know him in so far as he reveals himself in his relations to us. The question, therefore, is not as to the possibility of a knowledge of God in the unfathomableness of his being, but is, can we know God as he enters into relations with the world and with ourselves? God has entered into relations with us in his revelations of himself, and supremely in Jesus Christ. And we Christians humbly claim that through this self-revelation, we do know God to be the true God, and have a real acquaintance with his character and will. Neither is it correct to say that this knowledge which we have of God is only a relative knowledge. It is in part a knowledge of the absolute nature of God as well. The relations in which God stands to us, the revelations he makes to us, reveal something of what he is truly. In the statement, for example, God is love, we are affirming the most absolute possible about God. So I'm linking on your screen two videos we did on localized God, the localized God of the Watchtower, the God of J.F. Rutherford and C.T. Russell, and another track we did also on the Watchtower called The Little God of the Watchtower. Is the God of the Watchtower the God that James Orr is describing here in his classic book, Sidelights on Christian Doctrine? And next time, the evidence we have for God.